to see all of you. Some new faces, a lot of old faces. Fantastic to be back. Not old faces. No pun intended. So, aging. Age is just a number. Do you agree? Raise your hand if you agree. Age is just a number. Oh, wow. Okay. So less than 50% of the room. I expected more because we hear that term very often, or the phrase, and everybody seems to think aging is just a number. But I'm actually about to show you that that is only a myth. Sadly. Unfortunately, the body ages. And that is an inevitable process of life and our biology. And today you're going to see how the body ages, but I'm also going to give you some tools that will hopefully help you to slow down. I'm not going to say stop, because if I said that, then I would be God. But we can slow down the process of aging. But let's start, first and foremost, with some definitions. What is aging? What is the biological definition of aging? Getting old? Sure, absolutely. But what happens to the body? Yes. Did you have your hand up? Oh, you were just looking at half of the face. She had her hand up like this. So what is aging by definition? Yes. Say that again, sorry. Cell production slows down. Excellent. You had your hand up. Everything slows down, right? The body begins to slow all of its processes. But all of this gets us closer to what? As we age, what do we get closer to? Death. And death happens because of disease. So we age. As we age, we're more susceptible to diseases as a result of getting diseases, anything from cancer all the way to all sorts of other things. We become closer to death. So age, by definition, is the progressive accumulation of changes that are responsible for the increase of susceptibility to disease and ultimately death. The fancy biological term for this is senescence, which really means that our cells, every single cell in the body begins to senesce or slow itself down and eventually die. And they do. Every cell in the body begins to die as the aging process continues. And this entire process is inevitable. We know that because every single one of us will die. I'm sorry to break the news to you. So we know that it happens. We know it's universal. Every living being goes through this process. There's only one organism in the entire world that's ever been identified that is sort of the most mysterious case of aging, and that is does anyone know what it is? What's that? A jellyfish. It's a jellyfish that does not die, and scientists are studying this jellyfish to understand potentially the fountain of youth, because we have to understand something about the biology of this fish that never dies to really figure out how we can potentially stop or reverse or slow down the process of aging. But it is universal otherwise. Every other organism will die. And is it a disadvantage to evolutionary fitness? Is it good for us to age, or for think about the entire ecosystem? Is it a good thing for the entire ecosystem that organisms age, or is it better if they live longer? They age? Yeah, aging actually helps the ecosystem, because if we all lived, what would happen over time to the amount of food and everything that is available, the resources that are available? They would run out. So it's actually a part of ecological fitness for organisms to age so that they would die. But the leading cause Number 2. Cancer, very good. And number 3? Not Alzheimer's. chronic lower respiratory disease, so of the lungs. So these are the 3 leading causes of death when it comes to the aging population. And obviously, as I mentioned, when you contract a disease of any kind, including these 3, and of course many more that affect the aging population, we just get closer to that stage of death. And if we can find a way to delay the onset of these diseases, maybe we can delay the onset of aging and later on down the line, death. And what we do know is that in the US, the aging population keeps increasing. So this is obviously because of the advances that we've seen in the field of biomedicine and research. Now we have ways to intervene with many different diseases, even cancer. Some forms of cancer are now curable and will not lead to death. So the average age of the aging population is going up, and by 2020, by 2050 or 2060, this number is going to be huge. So if you look here, 98 million people are expected to be between the ages of 65 and 84 by 2060. That's a lot. So that means our lifespan is increasing as a population. The problem is, and I'll mention this at the very end again as well, aging is not just about lifespan. It's also about lifespan just means my life is extended. It's also about health span. Because imagine you live to be 85, but you're entirely dependent on other people or dependent on something to maintain you, some sort of a machine. So what we want is not just longevity, we also want to live healthy. We want to have quality of life. And today's talk we have actually a tremendous Now, the way diagram fascinating to look at, because if you think about it, when we're babies, right, when we're born, we have almost no hair, no teeth, our brain development is minimal, motor control is limited, we're completely dependent. All of these things obviously change as we become an adult and functions become more and more normal. And then what happens in aging? You go back to being a child. So when we hear that so-and-so's grandmother is acting like a child, it's true they are, because they become very similar to a child, even biologically speaking, because of the damage to the brain, because of the damage to all the different cells that have accumulated over the 60, 70, 80 years of their lives. So we go back to this. But if we could just find a way to sort of freeze time and be in that fairly normal stage for a longer period of time, then the process of aging would slow down. And scientists have tried to do this. There was a show, I don't know how many people watched Silicon Valley or watched, I don't even know if they have shows anymore. But in Silicon Valley, there was a show that was entirely based on real science, or an episode, sorry. And this was very interesting because what they had shown in this episode was that this very rich man, Gavin, had decided that he wanted to infuse young blood into his body, thinking that if I have young blood, then everything about my body should become rejuvenated and enriched, and I should be at the level of a young person again. This was not entirely unfounded, and it wasn't voodoo. It was based on real science from one of the most seminal experiments that was done in the early 2000s, where scientists, in fact, did do exactly that. So what Irina Comboy did, was she took a group of mice and either joined a young mouse to a young mouse to an old mouse, or an old mouse to an old mouse. They literally conjoined these, and these experiments are called parabiosis. So in this way, the blood of these two mice that are conjoined to each other is combined, which really means that in the case of the middle animal, the young and old conjoinment, the young blood is going into the old mouse, and the old blood is going into the young mouse. What do you think the results were? So let's focus on learning and memory. Let's say in terms of learning and memory, which one of these groups do you think does the best? Obviously the young, followed by young, old. And they actually do fairly well in terms of comparison. They're almost similar to the young, which suggests that the old animals had begun to receive some of the factors that are in young blood that are changing or reversing the process of learning and memory to improve it. So the idea here was that young mice make the old mice smarter, and the reverse was also true, by the way. The old blood was making the young animals, what's the politically correct way of saying less smart? That it was making them less smart. And that the idea was that this young blood is somehow restoring muscle regeneration even. So there seems to be something in young blood. And this was identified with these experiments. And these experiments were then extended to what are called clinical trials, because later on, the young blood was assessed, and a number of different candidate molecules were identified in young blood. And it was thought that if we could just take these factors and infuse them into old people, then we should be able to give them the factors that they need to stay young. Unfortunately, those clinical trials did not have any results. So this did not replicate in the case of humans. It doesn't mean that young blood in humans cannot restore longevity in old people. All it means is that we don't have the right factors yet. There is some sort of a combination of factors within young blood that will, in fact, help increase longevity in old people. We just have to identify it. And that's part of what the aging research is currently doing, is to screen young blood and see how it's different from old blood. And hopefully, if we can identify those factors, we can then inject those into ourselves, and maybe we can live a little longer or live with more quality. But until such time, we have to understand how the aging process happens in order to be able to delay it through methods that are at least within our control. None of us can go into a hospital right now and ask for young blood to be infused into our bodies. So let's think about more realistic ways to reduce this process down. So let's talk about some of the causes, because if we understand what makes us age, then that helps us to intervene. So the first step is identifying the mechanism. So why do we age? Does anyone know we talked about the biological reason of cells slowing down, right? Cells dying. But why? What causes cells to die as we get older? Or to get cancer? Yeah. Okay, so they have a specific program. You're getting very close. Anyone can add a little bit more to that? What's that? They senesce, but why? Right, which is very similar to what was just mentioned, but deep down into like the genetics of it. Say that again? Telomeres. What are those? Does anyone know what telomeres are?
Interesting question, Mitra.
My phone thinks telomere. What telomeres are is an interesting question.
Like extension on the end of the cells, and then they're broken down by the telomerase enzyme. Is that what?
Very close. So a little bit of basic biology. So the way that cells divide is basically your DNA is constantly replicating, right? And the way that one cell becomes two is that DNA needs to replicate and put itself into the second cell. Every time that this cell division occurs, every time that one cell becomes two cells become four, there are pieces of the DNA that get lost. Literally, there are pieces that get lost. And this is just the way that the replication process in the DNA happens. Now, if you think about it for a moment, that's kind of scary, right? Your DNA pieces, that's your genetic code. Your DNA pieces getting lost can be a scary thought. But obviously, the body, the organism knows that that's dangerous, and so it has a fail-safe in place for that. And those are called telomeres. Telomeres are these extensions at the end of the DNA that carry no genetic code. They're just there to protect the actual genetic code. So that every time that a cell divides, you lose pieces of your DNA, but what you lose are these telomeres, which carry no genetic information. So it's okay. You can keep losing them. But guess what? they start to shorten, right? As cells divide, as we age, and the number of times that these cells have to divide increases, now slowly these telomeres have gotten shorter and shorter and shorter until at some point, when the cell divides and it it loses certain pieces of the DNA, what does it lose now? It actually loses your genetic code. That is one of the leading reasons for aging. That is one of the main reasons why we get cancer, because that leads to mutations. So what we don't want is this telomere shortening, but it happens. That's one of the processes of aging. So this is one of the first mechanisms for aging. And this falls into the category of things like nature. We have no control over that, right? Our nature is just set up this way. And I'll tell you about a couple of other nature causes of aging as well. But the other aspect of aging that's not related to nature is what? Information? What do you mean? Inflammation. So we'll get to that. That's also nature related though, although it can be affected by some other factors. But what is in our control in terms of aging? Environmental. So anything nurture related. So under the nature category, the reasons why we naturally, every single one of us will age is all these different mechanisms of just the biological processes of the body. And we won't talk about all of these, but I'll highlight a few of them for you. We talked about telomere shortening now. We'll talk about a few more as well. But those we have no control over. This is just how the body is. But they can be indirectly affected by the way that we live our lifestyles. And that includes what? What are some ways that our nurture can affect our aging process? Diet, exercise, sun exposure. What's that? Smoking, drinking, stress, all kinds of different variables that can change the aging process. So nature is out of our control, but nurture is not. And that's the part that we're going to try and see today, how we can change so that we can address the nature. But ultimately, like I said, we need to understand these processes the way that they happen in the body. And the first one that we discussed was this concept of telomere shortening, which is showing us the crosstalk between nature and nurture. Because if we're not living a healthy life, then the amount of times that our cells are dividing increases, the risk of mutations increases, telomeres get shorter and shorter. So indirectly, we can speed up what nature is doing and get ourselves closer to that time of death. So this is the very first concept behind, or very first theory behind aging. Scientists still don't exactly know they can't pinpoint to one mechanism and say this is why we get old. But there are these leading theories, and these are helping us to better identify the reasons behind aging. This is one of the key ones. The second one, you mentioned something about inflammation. So what is inflammation?
Oh gosh. So, like, let's say a cell gets irritated and causes inflammation, then like the arachidonic cascade just triggers it.
It triggers a cascade. Very good. Do you guys remember, we talked a little bit about inflammation last time. Do you remember the name of a molecule that I used here in the lecture that gets accumulated over time in the body? Not lactic acid. What's that? No, not cortisone. Cortisone is a steroid. Cortisol is what you meant. But when cortisol goes up, what does it do to the cells in the body? They swell. When they swell, they're inflamed, and they release or they make something. What's that? No, sure. Cytokines as well, but these fall into cytokines fall into this category of things. What is it? Free radicals. So as cells age, they generate more and more free radicals. These are those toxic materials that we discussed last time as well, that every cell in the body makes. But obviously, as we get older, more and more cells have made these free radicals. They've made a ton of waste. And this waste is just accumulating in the body. And of course, the accumulation of this waste cannot be a good thing. Free radicals are toxic. They kill anything else that's near them. And this process will set off a cascade effect where one cell that is dying will release all of these free radicals. The neighbor right next to it will get affected by those free radicals, and it will then die as well. And that's how the process slowly accumulates. So a big part of the reason, or one of the other leading theories on aging, is that we just are accumulating all this waste over time. So if we could just find a way to reduce that process, reduce the waste. And one of those ways was mindfulness meditation, if you recall, as we discussed last time. That's one way in which we can reduce stress levels. Stress levels directly affect the amount of free radical accumulation in the body. So this is the second theory. And the third is the idea that the stem cell pools in the body slowly begin to deplete as we age. And all this means is that every single one of us right now have a population of stem cells in our bodies. These are the cells that keep giving rise to more and more of the same thing that we have. As an example, when you get a cut, do you heal? Of course. You heal because there are stem cells, there are skin stem cells in our skin that are helping to heal that cut. Otherwise, we would be walking around with an open wound all day. When we sprain our ankle or when we pull a muscle, we heal. We heal because it's the stem cells in the body that are helping to regenerate that damage or repair that process. But as we get older, these stem cell pools decrease. So there aren't as many of them because we've been using them to repair ourselves for 60 years. So now when we hit the age of 65 or 70 years old, we don't have as many of those stem cell pools left. So now when we get a cut or when we sprain our ankles, it takes us longer to heal because those stem cell pools are just not there. They're not as readily available to come and repair that process. And that's a major problem. So osteoarthritis, for instance, which is one of the leading causes of even mortality in the aging population, is partly related to the fact that the muscle stem cells in the body are not capable of making more muscle. When they don't make more muscle, the bone begins to slowly die off because it has nothing to support. If I have no muscle over my bone thinks, why should I be here? I'm just going to die. So this process can be significantly exacerbated when the process of aging can be significantly exacerbated when these stem cell pools get depleted. So these three theories are the main ones that help us understand why we age. There are many more as well. But they essentially open us up to understanding how we can intervene. At different stages of the aging process, hopefully we can find ways to reduce inflammation so that we're not accumulating as much free radicals. Maybe we can find ways to increase our stem cell pools so that we're just working with a larger population of stem cells before we get too old. So we have some control over these processes. Obviously, at some point, we'll lose all of that control once we die, but we can expand, we can delay that. And that's the whole point of understanding this process. But all of this doesn't just affect the organs in the body, the peripheral organs in the body, it also affects the brain. And perhaps that is one of the ones that scares us the most because we may have seen people who have gone through cognitive decline as a result of aging. We may have seen people who have gone through dementia. These are not easy. And dealing with these kind of diseases is not only challenging for the patient, but also for the caregivers. And we ourselves can begin to feel the decline. And it's very psychologically difficult for people to recognize that they're no longer remembering things, that they're no longer remembering where their checkbook was or where their keys are. And these kinds of things that you notice perhaps are more emotionally challenging to handle than when you show up to the doctor's office and they tell you you have cancer. That oftentimes is a one-time news that you get as opposed to watching your dementia or watching your memory loss over time, which is difficult to do. So the brain ages, just like the rest of the body. And we can identify very specific mechanisms as to why the brain ages. A lot of it goes back to the same theories that we just discussed earlier, but there are specific things that happen within the brain. that causes us to basically lose our memories over time and many other functions. One of them is the loss of neurons. Just like any other cell in the body that ages and dies, the neurons, which make up the primary cell population in the brain, also age and they also die. The less neurons we have, the less cognitive function we have. So if we want to stay alert, we need to increase the number of neurons in our brains. And we can do that. And I'll tell you how. Another is changes in the chemicals in the brain. These are called neurotransmitters. And the number of neurotransmitters, or the amount of neurotransmitters that we secrete, starts to decrease with aging. So there's less of them, and these neurotransmitters are what allows the neurons in the brain to communicate with each other. So when we're not making enough of them, communication slows down. And lastly, these connections in the brain, which are called, this is called the concept of neuroplasticity, where the neurons in the brain are coming, in order to communicate with each other, they're coming down a particular pathway and they're connecting to a second neuron. And the second neuron then connects to a third neuron. And this is how the neurons in the brain communicate with each other to tell me to move my hand, for instance, or to talk. This is a bunch of neurons that are communicating from my brain to my spinal cord all the way out to my hand that says, contract the muscles in your fingers, for instance. This process can change whereby the neurons of, let's say, the second or third cell just decide to pull themselves back. So instead of communicating the information to the next neuron that now needs to tell me to move my fingers, it just decides, I'm not going to communicate anything. I'm just going to hold myself back. And that is one of the processes of aging. That's just what neurons will do. Because it's not, they would rather spend the time and effort and energy of the body, the resources of the body, to maintain other functions. So they stop communicating with each other. And therefore, we start to feel that loss of function in the brain. And the way that we feel it is in a variety of different manifestations. The biggest one is memory loss. We just start to realize that we're not remembering things as well. But we can experience a lot of other things. We can experience slowing down of thoughts. When you may have heard of this idea of like a cognitive fog. You feel like you're just not really processing information as quickly as you used to, especially if you compare yourself to your youth or younger age. And then, of course, there's all kinds of other losses that we may experience, everything from motor function to vision to hearing to taste. All of these are related to the loss of function in the brain, which will eventually affect all the other organs in the body as well. So this is one that we really need to work on. We need to find a way to ensure that the brain stays healthy for as long as possible. Today, we're going to talk about some of those, but we also want to test our own memories and our brains a little bit. Trust me, these are not difficult, challenging exams, so don't panic. But we are going to do two exercises to determine where you are in terms of your memory function. The first one is one that's actually, it's a part of, it's not the entire exam, but it's a part of a larger exam that's usually conducted with people who are going through cognitive decline. So if somebody goes into the physician's office, the neurologist will ask them a series of questions. I only have several of those questions on here, not all of them. But these are the typical questions that they will ask to know what stage they're at in terms of their dementia. Are they at early onset or are they closer to Alzheimer's disease? So we're going to go through those questions together first. These are very simple questions, and all I ask is you can turn one of your sheets of paper around and just write down the answers to each of the questions as they come up. And you have 10 seconds to answer each of the questions. I am sure that's plenty of time for these questions. But you'll see a timer down at the bottom, and it will show you how much time you have. But the goal is to just write down your answer. No need to write the question, just your answer. And then at the end, I'll show you what all the right answers were. Does everyone have a piece of paper and a pen and is ready to go? Okay, so first question. What year is this? What season is this? What month is this? What is today's date? No phones. Oops, I forgot to set that one, so I'm going to advance it. And I believe this, oh no, what country are we in? And lastly, what floor are we on? Okay, so everyone has their answers, right? So we're going to review the answers to these questions, and hopefully your answers will match this. So make sure you got all of these right. So, if anyone, we are on first floor, right? Okay, I wasn't sure if there's something beneath us. So obviously, as you can tell, these are very simple questions. So hopefully most of you got most of them correctly, but if you didn't, that might actually be a reason to consult with a physician, because these should be relatively easy questions to answer. Yeah?
We call it ground floor. That's still the same.
That's fine. Yeah. That's fine. Whatever terminology you guys use for it. But this is the standard test that's used to assess whether or not somebody is in fact going through cognitive decline. And if you go in ever, I hope that that's never the case for you, but if you ever go in with someone who is at the onset of dementia, they will not be able to answer these questions. So this is how you know there's some impairment in memory, but this is also how you know how much the brain has been affected, right? For you, these questions are so simple. How could someone get this wrong? But when your brain is affected and it's gone through loss of so many neurons, it cannot get these questions right. So that was the first. The second test is actually very fun. So in this test, you are about to see a series of words pop up, one after the other. You'll just see them come up. And then they'll all go away, all the words go away, and there's a 15-second awkward pause where we all just look at each other and wait. And then there are a series of questions that pop up, 3 questions. Every time that the question comes on, please answer together as a group. So out loud, the question will just have an answer of yes or no. So give your answer as a group if you think the answer is yes or no. And you'll see why I'm asking you to do this as a group. So, are you ready? Oops. Oh my gosh. Sorry. One more time. One more time. So what happened? Yes. So everyone very confidently said candy was on the list. Why? It was the first one. Everyone confidently said car is not on the list. Why? It had nothing to do with the rest of this list. But almost everyone also said sweet was on the list. Why? Because you associated sweet with everything else that was on this list. Now, this is actually not necessarily a test of your memory, so don't worry, you're not experiencing cognitive decline because you didn't remember that sweet was not on the list. This is actually it's demonstrating the concept of associative learning, which is part of what the brain does. It associates things with each other, and that's how it learns. So it associated all these things that have to do with sweet, with the word sweet, and when you saw sweet, you thought it was on the list. But what's fascinating about this test is that if you give this test to a group of individuals who are starting to lose their memory, when you ask them if candy was on the list, they don't remember. Or if you ask them if car was on the list, they don't remember. When the pause in between the list and the questions was only 15 seconds. So there's a short-term memory loss. The sweet part is not an issue, but those first two you should be able to remember. If you're not experiencing any cognitive decline, you should immediately know that candy was on the list and that car was not. So this is a great way to also assess any potential damages that are happening to the brain if one is not able to answer these questions properly. So, going back to the concept of aging, now let's figure out how we can fight it. So now we know that it's possible that we go through these cognitive declines, but there has to be a way for us to intervene. One of the, obviously, I would say most medically common ways of interfering with aging is pharmacological. And this is just the basic concept of drugs, right? If you are undergoing cognitive decline, then you have to take specific drugs that are important for reducing that process. And this is generally prescribed to people who are in their mid to late onset of dementia, so Alzheimer's disease patients. Hopefully that's none of us here in this room, but there are ways to also slow the process down without drugs, because the drugs are really just masking the symptoms, right? They're slowing the process of full manifestation of Alzheimer's disease. But we can slow this process down before it even gets to a place where we're losing our memories. And that can be done by lifestyle changes. And today I'm going to talk to you about a few different things that have been studied, and the effect of these particular lifestyle changes on the brain has been shown in both human studies as well as animal studies. And one of them has to do with diet. Specifically, I'm going to highlight one diet with you that's called time-restricted eating. And by the way, I should give you a disclaimer on all of these. I'm not a physician. I'm giving these as an educational tool for you to understand that these are some ways in which you can intervene with the process of aging. But everybody should consult with their physicians if they're about to take on any particular paradigm or modality that I'm suggesting here, because it doesn't necessarily work for everyone. But one of those is time-restricted eating, the other is caloric restriction. I will not get into detail with any of these. I have an entire talk on each of them. So we're only going to scratch the surface of each of these today, but it's important to understand them. We will not talk about this, but I want you to know that there is a huge controversy about the use of supplements for aging. Vitamins A, C, E, and all other forms of antioxidants have been studied, and their effects on aging has been looked at, and it's been very controversial. So if you're going to spend your money on anything, maybe the better thing to do is to get a trainer than to, for instance, spend your money on supplements, because the results there are highly mixed. And of course, there could be many other ways. But the second concept that I'm going to talk to you about is enrichment, and that's specifically with either physical enrichment or mental enrichment, and of course there is social enrichment as well, but today we're only going to focus on physical and mental. And I'll tell you what enrichment even means. You'll see that in a second. So let's start with diet for a second. The two studies that I'll show you, actually one of them is a modality and it includes a whole bunch of studies. But the two modalities of eating that you're about to see come from a variety of different clinical studies and animal studies that have been looked at. The first is time-restricted eating. Anyone know what that is? Intermittent fasting. It's a form of intermittent fasting. And the concept here is that you restrict how long you give yourself to eat. And there are different amounts of time that have been studied in terms of what your window of eating hours should be. But typically, if you think about it, most of us eat all day long, right? From the moment that we wake up all the way to the time that we go to sleep. The concept of time-restricted eating says you give yourself a window of, say, 8, 10, or 12 hours. You tell yourself, I'm only going to eat within this window and not outside of it. That window can be from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. It can be from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. It doesn't matter, but it has to be a window. And outside of that time, you're fasting. So this concept has been extensively studied over the past decade and has had tremendous results in both animal studies and human trials, to a point where it's been shown to have effects on various aspects of health, everything from cognition and memory, all the way to a significant reduction in the recurrence of breast cancer. For women, 36% reduction with an intermittent fasting modality in women affected with breast cancer, which is huge, probably more than many of the common drugs that are even used for breast cancer. So it's had tremendous results. But again, like I said, important to make sure you consult with someone before you engage on this. I'm not going to go through all the details of these studies, but I just want you to see the breadth of different results that have been shown. Weight loss with intermittent fasting, reduced inflammation, just like we had talked about earlier, and this has been shown by a reduced incidence in diabetes. There's been improved cardiovascular function, improved physical fitness, decrease in breast cancer recurrence, just like I mentioned, and changes in the brain. So the hippocampus, which is the area of the brain involved in memory retention, is also affected as a result of intermittent fasting, and these have been shown in animal studies in particular. So that's the first form. So that's one way in which you can use your diet to help you. And again, I won't get into the details of it. If you're interested in this, this is another conversation that we can have in the future. But the mechanism behind this, the reason why intermittent fasting seems to work so well, is predominantly because of a process called autophagy, which is essentially the time that you allow your body and the cells within the body to heal themselves. If I'm eating all the time, my body is spending all of its energy to digest my food. But if I give myself a break, now the body has time to actually clear things out. And this concept is the foundation of why intermittent fasting and the concept of time-restricted eating works so well. The second is caloric restriction, which is basically dieting, but restricting your calories. You can eat whatever you want according to this particular modality, but it has to be limited. It has to be restricted. Your calories have to be restricted. And these studies started in, I believe, the mid-50s, and they were predominantly done on primates first, where they reduced their calorie intake by about 25 to 30% and identified a significant increase in longevity. These animals were living longer and they looked fantastic. In that other talk about caloric restriction, I have pictures of these primates. They look amazing for same animals that are either on caloric restriction or non-caloric restriction, and they just look so much healthier. So those were the initial studies. But then in the early 2000s, there was a UCLA faculty member who had actually gone into the Arizona biosphere to do a study with a group of his colleagues, not on diet or anything related to that. It was about a completely other concept that they were studying, but within the biosphere. So they had planned on living in the biosphere for 2 years. And that was the length of their original study. While they were there, they ended up having issues in terms of getting resources into the biosphere. So they ended up having to make their own food. And on top of that, they were reducing the amount of food that they were eating just because there weren't enough resources. So Wolford decided to start a second experiment looking at the effect of caloric restriction on the people who were in this biosphere. And he did this study serendipitously, and what he showed was that if you reduce caloric intake, so for them it was somewhere between 1750 and 2150 calories a day, and keep in mind this number may seem high to some of you, but these people were in the biosphere doing hard physical labor for about 8 hours a day. So 2150 calories actually for them is very low, in fact. But they reduced that, and they found a significant amount of benefits from just reducing the caloric intake. And this was a 2-year study. As soon as they came out of the biosphere, they went back to their normal lives, and all of these reset. So if you're going to take on a dietary measure, it needs to be a lifestyle. It's not something you do to fit into your wedding dress. You can do that, but if you want the benefits of it in terms of longevity, It needs to be something you do sustainably for the rest of your life. So these are the two diet-related concepts. The other two are related to the effect of physical aging, physical exercise. And when it comes to exercise, even from very old philosophers who probably knew nothing necessarily about aging, about the effect of exercise, we've heard things like even in old age, exercise and moderation can preserve something of young vigor. So if we can increase our activity levels and maintain a balanced diet, it seems like we can live longer. At least that's what these philosophers used to think. And now we know that that is in fact true. So for instance, in a study that was done about 10 years ago, this was called the 90+ study performed by a UCI scientist, Claudia Kawas, where she collected more than 13,000 people who live in Laguna Woods. And this area is called Leisure World. You may have some family members there, in fact. And she ran a study on them, and she collected data to find out what is it about the lifestyles of those who are living to be more than 90 years old that's different from the lifestyle of those who are dying sooner. And she found a whole bunch of variables that were identified, including alcohol consumption, caffeine consumption, diet, etc. Many things that we can talk about much more later. But one of those factors was exercise. And those elderly, the 90+ population that were exercising about 45 minutes per day, were healthier. They had a higher cognitive function. She was focusing predominantly on memory, and she showed significantly higher memory function in those individuals than those who were not exercising at least 45 minutes or up to 45 minutes a day. So clearly exercise seems to have an effect on the human population. But there's also animal studies, and these are really interesting, and I know that often we're more convinced with the human studies than we are with the animal studies, but the animal studies shape our understanding of human disease. And these studies, the first study that was done in animals using exercise to show the effect of activity, physical activity, on memory function was done by a scientist at UC San Diego, Rusty Gage, who basically takes animals and puts them in a running wheel. They put these mice into cages that have access to running wheels, so the animal voluntarily can run on these wheels. Whenever they want, they just jump on it. It's like a hamster wheel. They just jump on it and they begin to run. So that was one group that he had allocated to running, to exercise. The second group were swimmers. They would put them into just an environment to swim. So two groups of exercisers and one sedentaries. And in the first set of experiments that they ran, they actually identified that the runners had better memory function than the swimmers. But both the runners and the swimmers had better memory function than the sedentary people. And there is a hypothesis about the fact that swimming in the animal study did not show as robust of an effect as running because animals hate water. They get stressed out when you put them into water. And it's very possible that that counteracted some of the positive effects of exercise. But bottom line is that exercisers did better than those who were sedentary. So then he took that same concept and applied it to a comparison between aged and young people, or aged and young mice, because the first study was done in young animals, but he asked, well, can you get aged animals to run, and will that help their memory function? And that's exactly the test that he did. To test their memory, they put these animals into what you're looking at here is depicting a tub of water, basically. This would be a tub of water. And in this tub of water, there's a hidden platform at one of the quadrants. And in this tub of water, the animal will begin to swim around until it can find the platform. When it finds the platform, it sits on it, it's happy, it knows that it's safe. If it has good memory function, the next time that you put the animal into the water, it goes straight to the platform. But if it has poor memory function, it's going to keep swimming around before it actually finds the platform. So he looked at how long the young and old sedentary animals and the young and old runners are spending on the platform. in that quadrant. He divided basically this tub into 4 quadrants, and this quadrant was the one that you want to see most of the time of the animal spent in. And he made some comparisons, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just wanted to show you 2 of them in particular, where he showed that the young runners, this is the young runner group, was spending the most amount of time in the right quadrant, which is the quadrant where the platform is, and you can see that here. So they remember very well that they need to go back to the platform. These are the young runners. The young sedentary, not so much. Old sedentary, not so much. But the old runners also remember fairly well. Not as much as the young runners, but they're not too bad. So they retain part of that information when the old sedentary animals don't, and neither do the young sedentaries. So that's how tremendous of an effect exercise can have. And so he demonstrated, obviously, that this helps with memory function. Physical activity is helpful. And the mechanism as to why this is helpful is because of changes in the neurons of the brain. So he showed that what you're looking at here is basically each of these green dots that you see is a neuron. And this neuron is extending a whole bunch of axons and dendrites out so that it can make more and more connections. The more these animals were running, the more of these connections they were making. And so they were better able to retain their memory function. So this was the effect on exercise, but there's also an effect with enrichment. And enrichment simply means how much stuff you have around you that keep you engaged. And the way to test this with animals is to give them a cage that is full of toys. So typically, most animals in the laboratory setting are maintained in this kind of a cage. 4 mice per cage, and there's nothing in there. They just get food and water. But you can enrich them by putting a running wheel in there so they can exercise and have fun in there. But you can also enrich them by giving them a whole bunch of toys, novel objects that they don't necessarily recognize and they can go through and play with. And this is considered enrichment. So what these studies demonstrated was that, again, in the area of the brain that is specifically associated with memory retention, the animals that were in the enriched environment had a larger volume of that particular region. So just playing with novel objects with something that is new to you will increase the part of your brain, increase the size of the part of your brain that's involved with memory retention. And they tested the same swimming, they call that the Morris-Water, the animals in the same Morris-Water maze task. And again, what they showed is that the animals that were enriched, so if you're looking at the top, the 2 dots at the top, that is the first time that the animal was in the Morris-Water maze, but the enriched animals learn right away to go to find the platform very quickly after the first time that they're placed in the water. Whereas the control animals, the ones that don't have anything to play with, it takes them a little bit longer to actually identify where the platform is. Which again suggests that enrichment can help to change memory retention. So as I said, these are just a handful of things that we can do to combat aging. But these are great starting points. So changing the lifestyle in terms of our dietary habits and increasing physical activity. And physical activity, anything close to 20 to 30 minutes a day is enough. 45 minutes and more will just increase that, increase the positive benefits of exercise for the brain. But the minimum that we should be doing is somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes a day. And in terms of dietary habits, we got to pick something. If we find ourselves just being open to eating anything with no restrictions, with no time limits, something is wrong if our diet is not monitored in some way, shape, or form, whether that's the time or the amount or a specific food category that we're avoiding. Something in the diet needs to be controlled. And that's something that you can think about further yourself and, of course, talk to your physician about to decide what will work the best for you. Having said all of that, I just want to circle back and conclude with the fact that longevity is different. Longevity and lifespan is different from health span. The goal for us in terms of combating aging is not necessarily to increase the lifespan. It's to increase health span, We want to live a life that has quality, that is healthy. We don't want to live longer and then struggle with cancer. So the whole point of changing the lifestyle is really to target the aspect of health that can help us to live with more quality even in older age. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention. I'm sorry I went right up to the hour, but if you have any questions, of course, I'm happy to take them.